So I read sometime over the past week or two that for the first time, Wikipedia participation is actually flattening or falling off. And some of the interpretation that went along with that fact was that the generation of teens and young adults that are coming of age, they are less likely to take what is worth knowing, what it is important to know about the world, and to store that in language. They are more likely to exchange messages and to code what's important about the world in images. And so Wikipedia just doesn't draw their attention. They'll use it when they need to. They may contribute little things, or they may not contribute at all. And that, I think, Marshall McLuhan would be having a field day with this. This is fundamentally changing how a lot of people think. I think this may be yet another facet of the phenomenon that made so many people unprepared to differentiate between fake news and what could be trusted in the last election cycle. Of course, this exact demographic I'm talking about is the exact demographic that, going back almost the entire time we've had elections, has been the least involved in politics, the least likely to vote. Participation, that kind of participation, goes up as people move through the lifespan. And so it was actually older people, middle-aged people, who struggled a lot with separating fake news from what could be depended on. So maybe I am going a little bit astray with that idea. But where that led me to thinking this week, it got me to thinking about the farmer, about the United States back in the time when the Industrial Revolution arrived, and the farmer who could not participate in the Industrial Revolution because the farmer did not come to the city, became the hick, the hillbilly, the one who was left behind, and was the archetype of the one who is ignorant, of the one who is closed-minded, excluded, outcast, not attractive, not trendy, not affluent, low in socioeconomic status. Definitely the economic, but even more so probably the socio end of that construct. And that makes me wonder, in the decades to come, what is going to happen to the reader and to the writer who can't navigate images as easily, who do not get all of the facets and the inside jokes bound up with memes, even though I think memes have probably hit their high water mark and are even now receding, but who did not grow up on Snapchat. And I caught the birth of Facebook, and I even am reasonably up to speed on what goes on Twitter and what it tends to mean, although some of the insider references have got so obscure that I'm absolutely at a loss. But Snapchat and Instagram and the insider idioms that go along with those media, those I think have left me completely behind. I still take what is worth knowing, what it is urgent to convey to others, and I code it in language. And I think that the different way of generating and maintaining and archiving the things that you know, that you want others to know, or that you want to continue to know. I mean, I think it's, the farmer valued the land. The farmer very definitely paid close attention to the land. And those who moved to the city and took up the Industrial Revolution, participated in the Industrial Revolution, they lost their connection to the land. And for the most part, they valued it a lot less. And I worry that those who read and those who write will value the written word even while it's fading. We continued to depend upon farms even as we industrialized because our food had to come from somewhere. But then the farms themselves became factory farms. And a way of life of having a family farm, of farming being tied to your identity, of you participating in farming, that was romanticized and it was marginalized. And the world that we're going to see unfold in the decades to come, it's still, for a lot of things, going to be dependent on the written word. There are a lot of kinds of important operating information, operating instructions, operating protocols that you have to spell out explicitly in language. But already you can see the signs. I mean, the field of journalism is mortally wounded. I'm not sure I give it 10 years. And even more broadly, to think about people who are employed as writers. They're not writers anymore, they're content providers, and they're expected to crank it out. And sure, there is still creative writing being done in the entertainment industry. There are still novels and short stories. But it's different. And I've already talked in previous episodes about how striking it is that nobody seems to want to tell news stories anymore. They seem to want to stumble upon the story that is a hit, that reliably produces money just as dependably as a cow produces milk, and then they want to remake that story over and over again. Either they do it by making sequels, they'll make another universe and just crank out stories in that universe, or they will take a real simple story structure, change the names of the characters, change minor details, and keep on writing that story structure until they are forced, by the sheer boredom that's grown up around that story, to start making inside jokes, to start mocking and parodying the story. Because, they can't go out and find a new story to tell. That's far too risky. That, I think, is very much consistent and within the domain of writing giving way to content production, of farming giving way to factory farming, of the farmers moving off the land into the city to take up desk jobs. And the desk jobs are completely interchangeable. You can move from one office to another and learn a new line of work and go right back to work. And if you were farming, you could change your crops, but you would not change the fact that you were on the land and that there were things you had to do to be a good steward of the land. Leaving the farm also meant that there were lots of physical activities that were now mysterious, that were too strenuous. A lot of people who moved to the city and took up desk jobs, that's one of the factors that led to such a widespread epidemic of obesity. I mean, largely it was the manufactured foods and the weaponization of salt, sugar, and fat. But also it was the fact that just people's daily routines didn't get them any decent amount of exercise at all. And then there was also the loss of the knowledge of how to carry out a lot of operations that parents have taught to children for millennia. I mean, something as simple as starting a fire, or riding a horse, or weeding a vegetable garden. And, I learned how to weed when I was a kid in the backyard. It was one of my chores. I didn't do it that often, but I knew how to do it. I don't know how many of my students now would have any idea how to do it. And as the emphasis on reading and writing goes down, and as the emphasis on images go up, I wonder how many operations of putting things into words, of constructing an argument, are going to become just as mysterious as starting a fire is to a lot of city people today. It's funny because one of the classes I'm teaching right now is argumentation. And one of my students in there is doing an honors contract for the honors program where we are examining one of the side topics in the field of argumentation. Can visuals be complete arguments? Can you look at a picture and can that picture constitute an argument? And there are good explanations on both sides. But I think what we would agree on, and I think everybody in the field of argumentation would say, is the pictures that can argue are the exceptions to the rule. And that for the most part, if you want to convey an argument to an audience, the optimal way to do it in most cases is to put it into language, not to put it into a visual. You raise the level of difficulty quite a bit if you want to convey an argument using nothing but visuals. And so I think if this trend were to continue, And I may be guilty of thinking that what is the fashion right now is going to continue forever, when there have been all sorts of trends equally as apparently powerful as this that have just died on the vine, that have just turned a corner. I imagine there were people back in the 1960s who thought all the rebellion and all the radical critique was going to just build steam until all social institutions were torn down, and then the 80s happened, and we did a U-turn and started consolidating all of those social institutions again so that we can maximize how much wealth they provided to us. So it could be that the generation coming of age will go visual for a while and then realize what the frustrations are of going too visual, and they'll double back and there'll be a renaissance of reading and writing. That's a possibility. I certainly can't see into the future. And I'll also say, by way of reeling back some of these ideas, it's important not to get too one-sided and romantic about this transition. I mean, people moving off the farm and into the cities, and even family farms becoming factory farms, there were upsides to it. I don't want to get utopian, and I don't want to get dystopian. Small farm food can be filthy and disease-ridden. And when our food supply was a bunch of small farms, there were a lot of very healthy foods that simply weren't available at all. Now, there are good questions you can ask about should food be available out of season, and is mass-produced food as good as the food produced by families and artisans who take pride in the craft of growing, breeding, optimizing the food that they produce? But it's possible to get too romantic with that because, the scarcity was a real issue. The fact that there was simply less available and also a smaller population at the time, and that sanitation was not necessarily where it is today, that a lot of innovations came with the Industrial Revolution, and to just wave those aside and say small was good, big is bad, grossly oversimplifies it. In much the same way, where we are right now with the exchange of messages and even with the exchange of visuals, there are a lot of benefits to that. I worry about where journalism is, but in some sense, journalism's gotten better because there are far more things that we can see for ourselves. And even though we're still figuring out what this means and we're still trying to domesticate some of these changes, everybody can be a journalist. And I know, going back to the roots of the pseudo-profession of journalism, and I don't say that as a swipe at journalists, I just say it because journalists themselves are sometimes uncomfortable with being called a profession. Going back to its roots, the idea is that anybody who is observant and who can take a whole lot of events and boil them down to their essence and their meaning, that person is a journalist. So whoever is carrying a camera phone can capture a lot of things that 10, 15, 20 years ago, maybe not even that many years ago, but during the years I was growing up, we just had to take some reporter's word for it. We had to go by first-hand accounts, which we have been learning. First-hand accounts can be very misleading, and the nature of the evidence that a camera collects, it's not perfect and infallible either, but it doesn't fall prey to a lot of the weaknesses and shortcomings of people's narration in the absence. I guess that's a situation where I think we're actually better off with pictures than we are with language when it comes to reporting, when it comes to events. I think that there are enough conspiracy theories surrounding the assassination of President Kennedy. The Zapruder film at least gives us some basis to debunk some of those and to sort of herd them into a corner and say, but we can watch it happening. And they have their own theories about the magic bullet, and they've managed to take what is in that film, and they've managed to spin off a lot of other wild things. But as science has gotten better and better, we have some raw material to debunk those. And I'm in serious danger of getting completely wrapped up in my own thoughts if I don't get off this. The point that I was stumbling toward is, it's a mixed bag of blessings and curses that the move from the farm to the city in some ways improved things, and in other ways was the loss of a lot of things that were valuable that at the time we overlooked the value of, and we didn't do that good of a job of holding on to them. And I guess I worry that the same thing is happening if images become the mode of communication that a generation coming of age prefers, and they downplay the usefulness and they downplay their own skill with language. I'm afraid they're leaving behind something that they won't appreciate the importance of until it's beyond their reach without a lot of difficulty. All right. The other set of ideas that I had this week, fairly unrelated to the first. Today, in one of my classes, I'm getting to the end of a series of lectures talking about implicit bias and about how we grow up with a lot of our culture feeding into us the idea that people with certain characteristics or in certain categories are bad. So people who are disfigured are frightening. People who are have dark-colored skin. There are just too many messages in our color that dark is evil, dark is dangerous. In the dark, you're likely to be attacked. In broad daylight, you're more likely to be safe. Though your sins are scarlet, they will be as white as snow, so white is better than dark. And so I'm starting from thinking about implicit bias. The biases that operate almost as reflexes, that if you were to ask people if they have these biases, they'd be indignant and say, no, absolutely not. But when they try to do mental operations, when they try to associate races with descriptions that are good or bad, they find it a lot harder to do so because that bias is deep down in the fabric of reality as they understand it and as it was taught to them by their parents as they grew and as they enculturated. So I start with that. I get then to thinking about how for such a long time our understanding of alcoholism was that it was a moral failing. That if you were an alcoholic, it was simply that you didn't have the strength of will, you didn't have the integrity or the character, you didn't love your family enough, you were deep down lazy, you were a drunkard. Being a drunkard was a character flaw. And we've come to understand that there are actually malfunctions in your thinking and in your body's system of craving and reward that almost strip you of free will. I mean, there are decisions you make along the way that you are culpable for, but it's very different from when we thought it was simply a character flaw. And I think the same is true to a degree that too many of us don't fully appreciate for responding negatively to difference, for responding in not a fully friendly or accepting fashion to people of other races and people of gender identities that we didn't know existed, that I didn't know existed for the longest time until I was far into adulthood and far into middle age. Now, there's a danger that I can rationalize away my unwillingness, my stubborn unwillingness to confront my own biases. So I have to be careful in saying that I think that implicit bias, in some ways, it shares some characteristics with addiction, in that it's operating outside where I make decisions. People who are alcoholics may not decide to drink, but it is the case that if they don't want to destroy their families and inflict all sorts of harm on people, they have to decide not to drink and they have to decide to take extreme measures. But it's not as easy as that glib sentence makes it sound. And I think the same may be true for managing implicit bias. The other thing I had jotted down here, because this was rolling around in my head in the same bundle of thoughts, long about the time John McCain got his diagnosis of brain cancer, which he's currently battling brain cancer and the prognosis is not good. But I remember running across an opinion column that said, stop calling cancer patients warriors. Stop using the warrior image. Because what that does is it constructs them as people who run on courage. And if the disease doesn't respond to the measures they take, then they are left as cowards. And I think what we have done in the narratives we tell about civil rights advances is we frame them too much as heroes and villains. And one of the very first things I said in making this podcast was that I think down at the bedrock of my faith, you have to say that it's not okay to hate. And I think a corollary of that is it's not okay to paint some people as the heroes and other people as the villains. Because someone who is a villain is fit only to be hated. And someone who's a hero, you can have a hero who's flawed. But you can't have a villain who's flawed. You can have complex people locked in conflict. I think that's a perfectly okay way to understand things. But I think we are tipping over into the narrative of heroes and villains, and I think that's not appropriate. It's also just false to fact. I mean, it's a simplification that we find comforting, but it's one that we have to overlook a lot of things that happen to be true. There was a wonderful interview on Fresh Air a couple of days ago, and now I'm going to have to go back and find the interviewee, her book. But she talked in great detail about Brown versus Board of Education and about how we like to tell ourselves that segregated schools was our sin, and then Brown versus Board was handed down and America repented. And then the sun broke through the clouds, and it was a big step forward. And there's so much that you have to disregard for that to be the narrative you arrive at. That's just so blatantly, wildly wrong. I am afraid that with the current civil rights struggles having to do not just with gender identity, but having to do with relations between women and men, I am afraid we've gone far too far into heroes and villains instead of complex characters, all with their own shortcomings, locked in conflict. And so where I wind up, it becomes more and more challenging for people to talk to one another, especially across generations. You wind up with a pretty yawning chasm of incommensurability. Back in the 1960s, they used to talk about the generation gap. I'm afraid that we have a generation gap about to open up that will dwarf anything they grappled with back then between the language users and the image users. That, again, may be a little exaggerated, but I see some signs that give me cause to worry. And then on top of that, we've reached a point where we cannot disregard the forces that polarize us, that make us appear to be adversaries living in the same neighborhood as opposed to members of a community. We can't ignore those anymore, but we've fallen into the trap of thinking that it's a struggle for victory. And the hero and villain narrative is a large part of what's driving that. And I wish just once I would have a week where the thoughts that would come bubbling up in my head would give me some cause to be hopeful. This definitely was not that week. And the one thing that this was meant to accomplish in the first place was for me to get the thoughts that I could not get into words and to talk them out, and to be able to examine them and familiarize myself to them, and maybe take a couple of the puzzle pieces and put them beside each other. And that hasn't happened nearly as often as I'd hoped it would. I will mention, just by way of a program note, in case anyone's listening to this, that I actually decided this probably a month or more ago, but I'm somewhere in the 40s as far as episodes, and I've decided that I'm going to pull the plug on this thing after the 52nd episode, whereupon I will have been doing this for a full year. So far, I have not missed a week, and I feel pretty good about that. And if I can go a whole year and not miss a week at all, then I think I am going to declare victory and go home, as people like to say about the Vietnam War and the Afghanistan War. And this, I guess, is just a war with my own simmering, bubbling impressions that refuse to form themselves neatly into thoughts. And I will gather up a few more of them and be back next week with something not very organized, but something in it.